The great Calvin is amongst the first who is adduced by our author, essay page 3, as also he is cited in page 41. The first quotation from Calvin is, quote, "That wherever there is the pure preaching of the word and the pure administration of the sacraments, we may safely embrace that for a true church. And, says he, we are never to reject the society thereof as long as these remain, albeit otherwise it abound with many corruptions. Yea, adds he, some corruptions in the administration of doctrine and sacraments may creep in, which ought not to alienate us from her communion." Unquote. The Latin word which Calvin makes use of, and which our author renders corruptions, is vitium, and I humbly judge our author's translation is too strong. The word properly signifies faults, defects, or blemishes. Accordingly, I find that Mr. Norton, in his translation of Calvin, renders it faults and faultiness. But passing this, the very same testimony from Calvin is objected unto the dissenters from the Church of England by Dr. Stillingfleet, and I may make the same observe upon it, which Dr. Owen makes in his reply to Stillingfleet. In its enquiry, page 287, quote, "There is a great deal more belongs unto the pure preaching of the word and the administration of the sacraments according unto Christ's institution, than some seem to apprehend. They ought to be so explained, as that, from the consideration of them, we may justify our whole cause. But these may be wanting in a church which is not guilty of such heinous errors in doctrine or idolatry in worship as should destroy its being." Unquote. I have said what I reckon sufficient concerning the above characters which Calvin gives of a true church, and therefore shall not here insist upon them. But whereas our author tells us from Calvin that we are never to reject the society of the church as long as these remain, albeit otherwise it abound with many corruptions, or rather, as the word should be rendered, with many faults or blemishes, since Calvin explains himself in that same place, in the caution which he subjoins, and which our author here does not think fit to notice, I judge it deserves a room here. Hic autem patrocinear, etc., i.e., quote, "I would not have it thought that here I intend to patronize errors even the most minute, as if I judged that they should be cherished either by flattery or connivance. But I say, a church is not to be rashly forsaken for any trifling differences in which only that doctrine is retained face and incorrupted, wherein the safety is retained safe, and incorrupted, wherein the safety of godliness consists, and the use of sacraments as appointed of the Lord is preserved." Unquote. And in this all the seceding ministers will readily join him. This eminent divine proceeds to lay the arguments in his following sections against the Anabaptists in his time, whom he compares to the ancient Cathari and Donatists. And he charges them with inconsiderate zeal, who departed from the communion of the church, and reckoned such to be no churches at all, where they observed such blemishes in the walk and conversation of professors unsuitable unto their Christian profession. And having in very pathetic terms bewailed the unholiness of professors, he adds, quote, "They allege that the church of Christ is holy, but that they may also know that it is mingled of good and evil men. Let them hear this parable from the mouth of Christ, wherein the church is compared to a net, wherein fishes of all kinds are gathered, and the separation is not made until they are brought in unto the shore. Let them also hear that the church is like a field wherein good seed is sown, but through the fraud of the enemy it is mixed with tares, from which it is not purged till at harvest it is brought into the barn floor. Finally, let them hear that it is like unto a floor wherein the wheat is so gathered, that it lies hid under the chaff, till it is cleansed with fan and sieve, and at length laid up in the garner." Unquote. Likewise, in the other citation given us from Calvin, essay, page 41, he argues against the same principles of the Anabaptists, and improves some words from Cyprian against them. That is, quote, "Let no man challenge himself, that which belongs to the Son of God only, to be able alone to fan the floor and cleanse the chaff," etc. Unquote. As for our worthy countrymen, Masters Rutherford, Gillespie, and Durham, who wrote at the time when the above sectarian principles were prevailing in England, and forcing a way for themselves into Scotland, all the reasonings of these eminent men in the places alleged by our author are expressly laid against the above extravagant principles. As, for instance, Mr. Rutherford's peaceable plea, cited essay page 3, page 41, and page 42, etc. This book was written in defense of the doctrine of our Reformed divines and net church communion, and the argument as it is managed by Mr. Rutherford from the state of the Church of Corinth, cited essay page 42, concludes in the following express terms, quote, "Then it is unlawful to separate from the pure church of God, because a church is not constitute of visible saints, and a people all taught of God," unquote. That quote being from the Peaceable Plea, page 142. As Mr. Rutherford is here pleading against positive signs of regeneration as a necessary qualification of church membership, so all the seceding ministers join with him. But our author thinks fit to set his thumb upon the above conclusion of Mr. Rutherford's argument. Otherwise his reader might have easily perceived that Mr. Rutherford's testimony is not in the least against the principles of conduct of the seceding ministers. As for Mr. Rutherford's Do Right, cited in the essay, pages 3, 9, 10, etc., this excellent book, as our author acknowledges in the preface, page 8, is writ against the independence and the separation that Mr. Rutherford argues against. Through that book is a separation stated from churches that are not constitute in the manner I have just now mentioned, and therefore all our author's citations from that book are no wise to the purpose. The judicious Mr. Durham, upon scandal, is likewise frequently cited as essay page 19, 41, etc., particularly part 2, chapter 12. But in the beginning of the said chapter, when he states the question, he tells us that it is the same upon the matter with that betwixt the ancient churches and the Novatians and Donatists, and all his reasonings are against separation on account of the personal defects and blemishes of church members, or upon a supposition that such persons as deserve censure pollute the ordinances to others. But in his third assertion in the chapter cited, he acknowledges that if the office-bearers of the church be defective in the exercise of discipline, and if this defect, quote, becomes scandalously excessive, it may give occasion to them that are tender to depart and go where that ordinance of discipline is more vigorous, unquote. And certainly, where the defect is only in a particular congregation, this may be a sufficient relief for a tender conscience. But what shall be done when the defect is scandalously excessive in a national church, and that this is the state of matters in the present judicatories I have already evinced? Therefore, according to the judicious Mr. Durham, we may depart from communion with them, and in this case we depart not from the ordinances of Christ, but endeavor in that station wherein the Lord has placed us as office-bearers in his house, to cleave to his ordinances and institutions, both word, sacraments, and discipline. The author of the essay gives us likewise some passages out of the commentaries of the same judicious divine on the Revelation, page 4, 52, etc., particularly from his observations upon the church of Thyatira. From the very words as they are cited by our author, it is plain that Mr. Durham's argument is laid against the sectarian separatists, that is, quote, "Our Lord Jesus is no approver nor countenancer of separation from a true church for the faults of some members in it. Neither do faults in some members and defects in ministers and officers in executing discipline pollute the ordinances in themselves or to others who are free of that guilt," unquote. After he has reasoned to a good purpose on his head, he observes, quote, "It must therefore be an untender thing to burden honest souls with the apprehension of being polluted from the personal faults of joint worshippers or communicants," unquote. And he subjoins several weighty reasons and grounds for the proof of this. Our author concludes that Mr. Durham's reasonings in this part of his commentary, that, quote, "the words of the judicious Durham are plain and pointed against the separation from any church such as the Church of Scotland. It has been, is, and hath been since the Revolution," unquote. I must own that I cannot see that the words of the judicious Durham are either plain or pointed against secession from the present judicatories of this national church. They are indeed plain and pointed against such who affirm that the personal faults of joint worshippers pollute the ordinances in themselves and to others. And as he manages the argument from the state of the Church of Thyatira to excellent purpose against these principles, so he had good reason to be plain and pointed against them, when efforts were made, about the time when his lectures were delivered, to introduce these principles into the Church of Scotland, and when several professors in Aberdeen did in a short time declare themselves for them. But though he is plain against these unscriptural principles, yet his argument is nowise directed against such who affirm that secession is warrantable and necessary from a particular visible church, when, in her ecclesiastical capacity, she is carrying on a course of defection from steps of reformation once attained unto, and at the same time refusing to be reclaimed. As I have laid the argument for secession from the present judicatories, and for a presbyterial association from the support and defense of truth, from the positive and particular commands given to the office-bearers of the Church of Pergamus and Thyatira in the letter on secession, so the reasonings of the judicious Durham are not in the least against the arguments as I have stated it. And if I was to deal with the sectarian separatists, I would reason from the same scriptures and in the very same manner against them, and I wish that such who in our day are in danger of being ensnared into such extremes would seriously consider the weighty reasonings of the foresaid eminent divine. Our author, essay page 51, gives us a citation from Mr. Gillespie, that is, quote, "Beware of separating new lights. To separate from or to gather churches out of the true Reformed or Reforming churches hath not the least warrant from the Word of God," etc. Unquote. I heartily join with Mr. Gillespie. I do not think it very warrantable to depart from communion with true Reformed or Reforming churches. But surely our author cannot reckon that this national church, as she is represented in her present judicatories, is a Reforming church. When he tells us, essay page 59, quote, "I shall not say but the Church of Scotland may be worse at this day than sometimes formerly, nor shall I say but that she hath been upon the decline for some time," unquote. If she is worse, and if she is on the decline, then surely she is not a Reforming church. But besides, if our author had dealt fairly and plainly, he ought to have told his reader of these new lights, who these new lights are that Mr. Gillespie cautions against. And if we look to the beginning of that chapter, whence the above citation is taken, Mr. Gillespie observes that, quote, "'Tis pleaded by some who pretend to more tenderness of conscience than others, that to establish by the law of the land a confession of faith or a directory of the worship of God and the government of the church, and to appoint penalties or punishments upon such as maintain the contrary doctrines or practices, is to hold out and shut the door upon new light," unquote. And having likewise observed that the greatest deceits have been brought into the world under the name or notion of new lights, he gives 10 excellent directions and cautions concerning these new lights, and amongst others the above cautions cited by our author. 'Tis to be regretted that such new lights have of late appeared in our horizon, who plead against the establishment of confessions of faith, etc., by the laws of the land. If our author had employed his pen against such new lights, providing he had done it to purpose, he had thereby done more service to our Reformation rights and our Presbyterian interest than he has done by his essay on separation. We have a large quotation out of a letter of Mr. McWard's to some of his friends, essay page 53, wherein he warns them in pathetic terms against separation, as also another quotation from the Hind Let Loose. But I am wearied with pursuing our author's quotations, which are nowise to the purpose, and I fear I may weary my reader likewise. If he will take the trouble to read Mr. McWard's earnest contendings with his letter cited by our author, which is subjoined to the said book, or the Hind Let Loose, he will see with his own eyes that they all militate against our author. Particularly Mr. McWard in his letter is expressly for separation from the indulged ministers, and speaking of them he saith, quote, "For all of us will grant that many of them are godly men, but alas, their godliness, as it hath been pleaded, hath been of more prejudice to the work and interest of Christ than the ungodliness of all the prelates and curates," unquote. And the separation that Mr. McWard condemns is a separation that is not stated upon clear and just grounds, and every such separation ought to be condemned. As for these worthy and great men, Masters Webster, Hogg, and Boston, the first two are very often mentioned in the essay. They all contended against the defections of the church judicatories in a way of communion with them, and so did the seceding brethren at the same time, as I have observed in the introduction. And I humbly judge that the author of the essay is too bold, if he intends by the quotations he brings from their writings to determine what their conduct and practice would have been if they had lived till the present times. I have already considered in my printed letter his quotation from Mr. Boston, essay page 57. As for that excellent man, Mr. Webster, it is well known how deeply he was affected with the proceedings of the judicatories in his own time, especially with the injury that truth received by the slight manner in which Mr. Simpson was passed by the Assembly 1717. But the Lord did in a short time thereafter shut his eyes, that he did not see the greater evils that were a-coming. As for Mr. Hogg, whose letters are frequently mentioned by our author, the last of them bears the date, April 16th, 1717, and the postscript to his letter a sufficient answer to all the quotations that our author brings from them. That is, quote, "The preceding remarks relate to the circumstantiated case of this church, both now and before this time, as is formerly described," unquote.